we're going to talk about how the cell harvests energy from sugar, and that's going to be the focus of this video. So the introduction is basically life needs energy to function. Energy is ATP. Remember how we said ATP is the currency of the cell, and if you have a lot of it, you get to do a lot more things. If you have very little of it, you don't get to do a lot. So like your muscles need a lot, and your brain need a lot. And cells that don't need tons, like let's say maybe your liver, doesn't have to require as much ATP as like your brain or your muscles. Therefore, life needs ATP to function. And ATP is what we're going to basically focus on in this chapter, and how basically the glucose, which is sugar, gets converted into ATP in the mitochondria. And the big picture is that on the planet, we basically have two different types of systems. One is going to be a system that's driven by sunlight called photosynthesis. And basically what happens is photosynthesis takes CO2 and water and does this brilliant reaction to basically turn it into glucose. And then we need glucose and O2 to do cellular respiration. So a plant makes glucose plus O2, and we go ahead and take that glucose and O2 and we produce water and carbon dioxide. Water and carbon dioxide is needed by a plant to basically go ahead and make glucose. So we're this perfect little system that comes together. Our output is ATP and a bunch of heat, and let's talk about what the difference is between breathing and respiration. Breathing is basically the intake of O2 and producing CO2 waste, where cellular respiration is what we're going to be focusing on in this one. So breathing takes place in the lungs and basically happens in the lungs, and the oxygen and CO2 is carried to the blood. Cell respiration is the intake of that O2 and energy, which is going to be glucose. We're going to turn that into energy, and we're going to make ATP, and then our waste products, like we talked about, is going to be CO2 gas and water from that cell. We're going to go ahead and synthesize things. So the cell gets the oxygen from us taking in a breath and getting it into our lungs and eventually moving it to all of our cells in our body. All trillions of them need it all the time, and if they go a couple of minutes without it, they die. So they go ahead and start to make this thing called waste, which is CO2 and water, and the CO2 will actually go back into our blood as well as the water, and the gas will actually leave our lungs. If we don't get rid of the CO2 quick enough, our bodies will start to get, the pH will start to change in our blood, and as the pH starts to change, we're going to do these things called denaturing. We're going to denature cells and red blood cells, and a whole bunch of problems will start. So the big picture is O2 comes into our lungs, that's going to be breathing, and then the CO2 is going to come out. We're going to go ahead and have diffusion occur in the lungs, where they're going to go into our bloodstream, and O2 is going to go to all the billions and billions of cells in your body, and they're going to go ahead and make a waste product, and that waste product is CO2. That CO2 will then eventually get back to your lungs, and then you breathe it out. So cellular respiration's purpose is to make energy. And this formula you have to know. You have to know it for your practical, and you have to know it for lecture. And it's basically, let me first read it, and then I'll kind of go into the minutia of it. It's glucose plus oxygen in the cell gets converted into carbon dioxide plus water, and the byproduct, the thing that we really want, is ATP, energy. You'll need to know glucose as C6H12O6. Just kind of think about it as 2 6s, and you add the 2 6s up, it's a 12. That might help. The O2, we need 6 of them. And when we come out, we're going to have 6 CO2s, 6 waters, and a ton of ATP. So this is also known as aerobic respiration because it requires oxygen, and the minute oxygen is taken out of the equation, everything starts to stop. Since energy is being produced inside the cells, it gives off heat, and heat is called exergonic reaction. Endergonic means it's going to be a reaction that's going to be cold. Exergonic is a reaction that's going to give off some heat and energy. So this is going to be an exergonic reaction. And you know this because if you feel your forehead, you'll notice that you're warm. And you're warm because it's an exergonic reaction. If we did an endergonic reaction, we'd notice that we were getting colder. Photosynthesis is the opposite, endergonic. Therefore, the formation of ATP is a exergonic reaction. So how do we use ATP? ATP is energy. We use energy to do everything that we need. We need it to keep our temperature warm, do homeostasis, move. Anything that we need, we need it. We need energy all the time. One measurement of energy is called a kilocalorie. So a kilo means 1,000 calories. So we use about 2,200 kilocalories a day, but a kilo, K, means 1,000. So if we times that out, it's going to be 2.2 million calories is what we actually need a day, or intake a day. But this number is too hard to grasp. That's why we put the K in front of it, the kilocalories, and that's what we're talking about. So if you actually have 100 calorie bar, it's really, 1,000, it's much, much, much higher. On food packets, you'll see a calorie that equals 1, and a kilocalorie, we kind of get rid of it because if people knew that they were intaking 2.2 million or 2.5 million calories a day, it might not make sense. Okay, so let's look at this reaction. It's C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6CO2, turns into 6H2O plus 6CO2 plus ATP. So this is what we call cellular respiration. It has three main things that it kind of goes through. We're going to go through these glycolysis step. Glycolysis is the sugar being broken down, and this happens in the cytoplasm. We have this step that's called the preparatory step, which we're going to go ahead and prep the byproducts of glycolysis to get into the citric acid cycle, or Krebs cycle. And then finally, we have the electron transport chain, and that's where everything we make a ton of energy from. So for the next couple of videos, I'm going to actually handle each of these separately. But this will be the big picture that you'll kind of understand. So imagine this whole thing is the cell, and this bean-shaped sort of thing is the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Glucose will come in and sort of get split into this thing called pyruvate, and this happens outside the cell, so we call this the cytoplasm, that liquidy area. Eventually, pyruvate will come into the cell and go into our next step called the Krebs cycle. And eventually, all the byproducts that we make, that I'll talk about in my next couple of videos, will go to this last thing called the electron transport chain. And this is where we're going to make the most ATP. And then this energy can get utilized in the cell somewhere, and then eventually come back to these steps to get recharged. Our first step will be glycolysis, and we'll talk about that in our next video.